Welcome everybody to our patch 13.8 rundown. My name is Quintic. Today I'll be using my predictive criteria and intuition to tell you if these changes matter for amateur play. Remember that our default is no, they don't, but we'll still go over everything and we'll still contextualize all the changes so that you know if you need to make any major updates to your pools and if anything significant is going to change in our draft strategies. So Aurelion Sol was last updated 2 patches ago. It was not that long ago. And that was his last damage change. Let me just go back and see what I did. On 13.5, I didn't think he lost 228 effective HP versus physicals at 16, which was a big deal. And then on 13.6, we've acknowledged that top-level Aurelion Sol counterplay is developing, but that we're still not punishing him well enough in the early game. He lost meaningful DPS, he lost meaningful CC, and Aurelion Sol, sure enough, stopped being overwhelming at top level. But we're not top level, and we're at a level where apparently he was still dominating even more than I thought, so they're hitting his durability. At 16, he is losing yet another 200 EHP versus physicals. So now compounding with his 13.5 changes, that's minus 400 effective health versus physicals baseline. Remember, that's against 80 carries in the late game. That's against physical bruisers that, like, if he's getting in your face, that is a meaningful damage reduction for Aurelion Sol, right? It's going to be more difficult for him to fly multiple times throughout a fight. Exactly the same impact as on 13.5, except twice. Again, this isn't the type of change that will remove all of Aurelion Sol's value. He still has, like, some outstanding control value, and most of the impact comes later, where he's harder to deal with anyway. So, you know, weaker, pickable, kind of all we can say about that change, right? Ezreal is receiving an increase to his base AD. Ordinarily, we would say DPS change to a DPS champion, therefore irrelevant for a change in pick conditions or in champion pool management. In Ezreal's case, sure, that has marginal implications for Divine Sunderer builds and Trinity builds. That has implications for poke damage, so this is actually, in reality, a poke champion receiving an increase to poke damage when he's played in his Essence Reaver style and he's not auto-attacking properly. So, like, ultimately, we would look at this and usually, by our criteria, not care. In Ezreal's case in particular, we'd say, that's probably a small change that we should, you know, maybe Ezreal's a little bit valuable, but nothing crazy. Garen is receiving the same. He's receiving 3 base AD and he's receiving base armor. Again, I mean, we can actually classify Garen as a burst champion. I would like to see how his spin interacts with that. Judgment is a spell. Actually, everything that Garen does scales off of total AD, not bonus AD. So that +3 increase per spin, definitely not too bad, right? Okay, so Garen is receiving a completely irrelevant amount of armor. You know, as we can see, at level 18, that translates to 47 effective HP against physicals. That's completely irrelevant. At level 1, that translates to 13, completely irrelevant. It does interact with armor penetration. That's important to note, but Garen is not usually going against champions that are going to be stacking lethality. It'll impact, like, a few matchups, maybe a little bit, right? So I would argue this is, like, negligible. Garen players are talking about some Garen jungle stuff with these base AD changes. I'm not knowledgeable on that. I don't know how much of it is a meme. I don't know how much of it is just Garen players saying, hooray, I can play my champion when I got autofilled, like, a little bit more. But since it does impact his spin and base AD changes do impact jungle clears a lot, I will explore it. I cannot comment on it very much. Solo lane Garen is negligibly impacted. Okay, so buffing Janna is absolutely absurd. It was my opinion that between 12.10 and 13.1b, which is the change where the Grievous changes went through, Janna was just the best support in the game. She was a sleeper pick, but she was... and she was not favored by the meta, to be clear. But if the circumstances for Janna came out, she was the most disgusting, uber-broken pick in the world. Now, I did realize that, yes, Janna actually did fall in power, because one of the big things completely making her broken was the moment of her ultimate, which was absurdly overpowerful. And so making an 800 gold Oblivion Orb more effective into that did impact her. So I suppose she might have room for, like, a little bit of buffs, but she's still an outstanding champion, right? What she's getting is a shield decay timer change, which I think is fair and won't break us entirely. And we're getting a 10 damage increase plus a 10% AP increase. Fortunately for us, this isn't an increase to her shielding output. This isn't an increase to her cooldown, like, uptime. This isn't an increase to her, healing output. This isn't an increase to her roaming power. All of the things that are, like, truly, truly busted about Janna. And so this will be a very, very small change. We don't have to worry about Janna's Reign of Terror immediately coming back, right? So, negligible. Jarvan, very strong champion right now. We have an AD growth change, so he's getting less damage throughout the game, and we are losing 10 base damage on our Q, which will slightly impact clear speeds. In that context, we can say DPS change to a DPS champion, and the AD growth change is probably not going to significantly impact clear times because we care more about base AD changes in that department. And so Jarvan is going to be slightly less powerful, but not significantly by any means. Kayn! Shadow Assassin Kayn is above many junglers in terms of win rate and ban rate, especially in eastern regions. Well, that would explain why I haven't seen him very much. Also, I think the champions that I play just perform well into him, so I didn't really know. Wow, that's... I gotta say, like, this is a spell that we would desire to have almost 100% uptime on, so Shadow Assassin Kayn can achieve some kind of poke fantasy. So that he is more capable of hiding in your walls, like hitting W's, whittling you down, playing off his team like that until he can one-shot you. The movement speed and the cooldown here is also what helps him to terrorize the map and makes him a macro menace on top of all of that. Those are changes that do matter for Shadow Assassin Kayn, right? So I don't have any criteria to assess movement speed. I do have criteria for cooldowns, and Kayn is definitely hitting... because it's like, so we can consider this adjacent to a poke spell, we can consider this a core personal defense, we can consider this almost in combat spammable mobility. It's not at our 6-second window. It is a spell with ideal 100% uptime, so that is power impacting. That does suck for Shadow Assassin Kayn. In amateur play, like, because if he's dominating solo queue off just the macro threat he exerts from this, that's also his greatest strength in coordinated play too, just being able to accelerate himself like that. I don't think Rost is particularly ridiculous. So I think we can conclude together that this hurts theoretically optimal Kayn. This hurts theoretically stable Kayn, but in lower elo conditions where he's snowballed properly, or in conditions where you are just an exceptionally good Kayn who is fighting like regular all-ins rather than just playing for poke, in those circumstances, these changes wouldn't be like too bad. But because it impacts theory, I would assess it to be a bit of a problem where some Kayn players who are less comfortable on him and just using him as a supplement in their pools might want to consider shifting things around a little bit. Right. So Kha'Zix got his changes last patch that I predicted would kind of be, just fine quality of life for Kha'Zix, wouldn't really create any more pick conditions, and they said that they were in fact pretty light. Now what they're giving him in exchange is plus 10 damage on his Q, and so that is a outside of threshold change to a burst champion. We can consider some Bruiser Kha'Zix DPS sort of things, and in that context, it's plus 10 damage per 2 seconds, which eventually with haste, because if we get up to 100 haste, 50% cooldown reduction, that is a plus 10 DPS change. Even that just ultimately boils down to a DPS change to a DPS champion within that context. So in burst context, like, this isn't creating any Kha'Zix pick conditions either. Still, if you're a Kha'Zix player, you'll look at that and say, nice, sure, I get some damage. Okay, Kog'Maw is getting a set of changes. Now, immediately, well, first of all, when was Kog'Maw changed last? I have to know. Kog'Maw was changed last on 12/11 when he was hotfixed off the durability update. It left Kog in a spot, like Kog'Maw's good damage-wise. He's genuinely better than a lot of people think, but he just takes so much to actually defend. He takes, like, specific contexts to really find his perfect value. So that's why he feels like he's more situational than other hyper carries, right? So what does he get? Oh boy, a passive buff. Something that we should never be using properly, but alright. He's ghosted. Cool. That's a necessary change. That should have been in the game anyway, right? The mana cost early on Void Ooze is going down and the slow early is going up. So this is a buff to Marksman Kog'Maw more than AP Kog'Maw, because this is your first max spell in that context, and it's not really changing in any meaningful way for you if you're maxing this. So it's just greater access to Kog'Maw's slow, which actually does make it easier for him to defend himself, makes it easier to play off his range. I think this does matter. I think this is meaningfully power impacting for Kog'Maw. Caustic Spittle going from 8 to 7 seconds. This doesn't hit the types of spells where cooldown changes like really matter. And so we've kind of just labeled it a DPS increase to a DPS champ, and it's a nice thing to have. So really, it's if you believe that this slow increase, the 10% slow increase for early game or for Kog'Maw 80 carry, matters for his self-heal and makes it easier for him to exist, then he is far better than before, especially in the tank-heavy games where his niche can really excel, right? Leona, very bad champion right now, almost entirely killed by the durability update, frankly. Still valuable in sub-masters amateur play. Still valuable, because she's still simple and she still does her job as advertised, right? She's still fine. But the big problem is that she's extremely committal and then lost all of her damage in the durability update. So she's not doing enough damage to justify her immediate engage. And then what that does when you have a situation like that, it's why Rel was so bad for so long. You're telling your teammates, follow up immediately with enough damage to finish off this target, or I will die, and my CC will amount to nothing. Now, the alternative thing that you can do in a situation like that, if you don't have enough damage to back up your engage, you can also just have enough raw survivability to continue outputting CC. And that's actually why Rel started to become reasonable, because she doesn't die immediately and because she does have her own source of healing. And because she does have a wombo niche, right? So it seems like what they're trying to do is actually up Leona's resistances to make it easier for her to survive in the fray. This 10 damage, completely irrelevant. This is not anything. So we need to ask ourselves, does this plus 5 armor and plus 5 resistance increase matter enough for Leona to justify her existence? Let me double check what Braum got. I think Braum was 10 to 20, something like that. Yeah, so you have to realize Braum received plus 10, which is actually really significant, and he's a significantly less committal champion offensively. So what I'm seeing from these Leona changes is a small increase that will be nice and appealing for her, but not enough of an increase to kind of get her out of jail where she's just strictly worse than Nautilus or a Mumu or, you know, other engaged supports that either offer more damage or more, you know, just a greater moment of CC or something like that, right? I just think she's not tanky enough and doesn't do enough damage, and they slightly address those, but probably not to enough of an extent, right? That said, if you're playing Leona in amateur, she's going to be fine, and you don't care, right? Lillia, a champion that I would really love to be playing right now, but unfortunately, my team needs me to have a different skill set. So we've talked about Lillia like kind of recently. She got a change on 13.1b. I'm just trying to remind myself what that was right now. She received some passive buffs that were fully offset by demonic embrace nerfs. Oh, and that's right. And she just literally was not dealing enough damage to justify her Liandry's builds, and she was pretty much fully abusing demonic embrace plus tank builds for value. And she was existing in a meta where power farming was really devalued, except she's a pure tempo champion, so when power farming is devalued, that kind of sucks. When having a tempo advantage on your opponent and denying camps is devalued, that really sucks. So Lillia did get a little bit empowered by the changes to enemy jungle camps, where like the damage penalty to hitting them is kind of gone. She did get slightly empowered by that, I suppose. Let's see what the actual what she is actually receiving. She is receiving okay, she is now allowed to deal 20 more damage to monsters through passive early, which is kind of a big deal. Up to 40% more damage at level 1 against monsters. All single target camps hit the new max HP cap. Her clear speed is impacted. Pure tempo jungler. So that's power impacting. That's valuable. That's good. That being said, remember, clear speed doesn't really matter at like platinum and below. And tempo junglers are kind of hard to execute at that level of play. So, I mean, theoretical Lillia is faster and better at achieving her game plan. and we'll have to kind of wait and see if that trickles down to lower levels of play. Healing against monsters, that's kind of a big deal. That makes her harder. Oh my gosh, the AP ratio up dramatically. And healing against champions, nerfed base, but up 12% AP. So really trying to pushing her into pure damage-oriented builds. Since the passive ratio didn't go up, like it's really just her healing, which is important, which is valuable. It says build more damage and you will get more durability. These are nice changes to Lillia. I personally am not qualified enough to tell you at our level of play whether that makes Lillia more appealing, but I would suspect that Lillia is back on people's radars a little bit at top level, at least investigating whether she's worth playing again. Who could have predicted that increasing all of Malphite's ratios over a course of multiple patches would eventually make people realize that he's absolutely giga-broken? They increased the attack armor ratio by 5%, they increased the cleave armor ratio by 5%, and they decreased the cooldown, which is a big deal and made WMAX a lot more appealing. Without rolling back the cooldown, I find it hard to believe that all of Malphite's combat power is going to be gone. We actually can just say, like, okay, so each attack is worth 20 less. That is a pretty meaningful DPS reduction. Reducing the cleave by 5% armor does impact his wave clear. Like, this does matter, right? This really does matter. However, it hasn't rolled back the cooldown. It hasn't rolled back all of the incentives for pure WMAX. You know, because we've been over this in a previous video. When he got these 13-4 changes, I was saying, like, wow, look at all these previous buffs. Oh my goodness, E, ground slam, armor increased, base damage increased. Wow, mana cost no longer increases with ranks. Wow, he got, like, I mean, that's a nothing change. His AP ratios went up. This doesn't really matter, but it's something. Wow, Granite Shield cooldown, actually a really big deal. Wow, Thunderclap cooldown now decreases with ranks. Wow. Like, Malphite's still in a position where he's not locked into Q max jail, right? Where he's not forced to max Q, which actually does make him a weaker champion overall when he's forced to do that. I think this will hit Malphite's power. It will reduce his ability to just clap everybody in lane, and it will, like, make him a little more exposed to his counter picks again, which is good and necessary. However, look at yourself, honestly. Look at yourself in the mirror, right? You are a sub-masters amateur player. Are you really telling me you're good enough to, like... just deal with the Malphite? You can put him down like 40 CS, doesn't matter. He finds one ultimate, you misplay. We're not good at the game, right? So, I mean, now that Malphite does have lanes that he can lose, because this, I do think, even though we would ordinarily say, haha, DPS nerf to a DPS champ, I do think this does matter for extended trades. Even though he does have a few more lanes he can lose, I really don't think he's going to be, like, dramatically impacted in power. I'm not even going to talk about this one. Can we skip this one? Like, I will say that +4 armor in early skirmishes is a real thing that does matter, especially on a champion whose game plan is fundamentally built around taking invades and taking duels. That will matter. It's just, you know, it's going to be such a small change that's... really, it's not worth going in depth at all. So, Poppy has seen better days, and she hasn't excelled in any of her roles for a while. You mean the champion who's deliberately supposed to be niche isn't, like, fully excelling all the time? Wow! Hammershock's cooldown gets ridiculously low, which, you know, in essence will transform... Like, we can approximate this as a +1% max health DPS buff. It's not exactly that. It does apply twice, so it kind of leans more into the DPS. The cooldown, like, trivially gets to, like, 3 seconds. So it is roughly that, and that is a very meaningful damage increase to a DPS champion. Like, when we have percent health damage and we see 1% max health DPS, we do care. It is a little bit power impacting, right? +2% bonus resistances, doubled to 24. I mean, all of this really just looks like top lane Poppy buffs, if I'm being honest. Like, if you find a good Poppy angle and Poppy's in your pool already, then you are doing more and your lane phase is easier to play. Not going to make her broken enough to just add to a pool that she's not in, though, so... And, you know, like, maybe this will impact her clear, and maybe Poppy jungle will be... I would love to be playing Poppy jungle, if I'm being honest. But can't really say more than expected QOL. Okay, we'll calculate the change on Rakan. Okay, Rakan is at level 1 losing practically nothing. It's 12 EHP versus physicals. At 6, he's losing 30. That is still outside of our burst threshold changes where we care. At 16, which is a little unrealistic, he's losing only 100. At like 13, which is a lot more. 60-ish at 11 to 75 at 13 starts to matter for sure. Losing 124 is nothing to sneeze at, but we're not really expecting to get to that point. So when Rakan is healing you for 13 more billion HP in lane, and his cooldowns are unimpacted and stuff like that, like, I think there's still enough base power in this champion's kit, to justify him. I mean, especially when an item that he actually enjoys is getting some changes in a way that he might enjoy. That remains to be seen. Yeah. Practically no changes in this entire patch for champions actually matter. The criteria says none of this is significantly impactful. Aurelion Sol, that's major, but can be offset by playing around it differently. Kayn is major, except in the levels of play that we're at. Kog'Maw might be major. I really do think Kog'Maw is potentially the most impactful change to the patch, and we'll have to look at Lillia, but like really none of this did anything. So let's talk about a change that does matter. Cosmic Drive. Because remember, systemic changes are the biggest catalysts to change. Systemic changes matter the most. They have the most sweeping impacts. They do impact more around the game. And Cosmic Drive is becoming much, 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 much more usable. Now, base AP goes to 100. So think about what this is right now. This is a 100 AP, 30 haste item, which usually had a passive that doesn't really matter. Cosmic before said once you hit 3 spells, now you have plus 40 AP for a total of 130. You gained some movement speed, but then it came at a time when you'd already just spent your cooldowns on a lot of champions. And sure, you're getting more cooldowns back. It's supposed to be for your second rotation, but it was still awkward, right? It was still really awkward. So now, damaging a champion, excluding damage over time, generates a stack of 2.5 movement speed every 1.5 seconds for the next 5 seconds up to 4 stacks. Add 4 stacks, gain an additional 10% movement speed. Dealing damage refreshes. So you will gain a total of 20% movement speed. It works like Grasp. You will need to hit them twice, right? One spell can't fully stack the passive, as they're saying. It is Grasp. If you've used Grasp, it stacks like Grasp. This is really, 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 really good. Now, let me contextualize this for you, too. I see some people calling out some useful stuff in chat, but, calm down, a little bit. Because, what is this? Last time this item received a change, we identified that it was pretty much like the dream utility item. It was a tremendous stat stick, right? It was an item that provided virtually no useful passive and just really good stats. And those stats were most useful on utility champions because those were the champions who would most value raw 30 haste over something like penetration. If that's who it would beat, it would beat. On those champions, it would beat an option like Shadowflame, or Early Void Staff, or Death Cap or something. I mean, it really was a Death Cap competitor. It really was. But it was a lower immediate damage. Cosmic Drive is really, really, really cemented now as a DPS item. It is a DPS item for sure. It is the primary magical DPS item, Nashor's Tooth aside. So if you are not an auto attacker, not a Nashor's user, and you are a DPS mage, this is for you. It's still quite good on our utility champs that we were talking about, Seraphine, just because it's a stat stick for them, but so something like Cassiopeia comes to mind. Not because Cassiopeia particularly values the haste, but because Cassiopeia absolutely values this movement speed. This is super good for Cassiopeia. Who else would it be good on? There is potential for it on Ziggs, although he's not the user that I would most get excited about. It says excluding damage over time, so we're going to have to figure out how it works on Singed, because Singed would love this if he could find a way to make it work. It is a 3,000 gold item. Silas loves this. Again, he's a DPS champion. This would be super good for him, right? So who have we mentioned here? We said control mages like this, a super nice Orianna item, a Victor item. Okay, see, so my only problem with those champions is it does have to win against pen items. So I'm thinking of this as second item primarily, and it would probably lose the Shadow Flame argument on champions like that, on Orianna Victor. And then we have to compare it on third, Shadow Flame, and it might lose the Seraph's argument there too. And then we would have to compare it against Void, and if we're on a Seraph's involved build path, then Void like almost certainly wins. That said, I think Cosmic Drive with this movement speed, I think it starts to become really valuable late build on probably most mages. It has to compete against Death Cap, so it's like if you're primarily playing for burst, Death Cap probably wins. If this movement speed would work on you because you are getting more involved in combat, then I think Cosmic Drive probably wins. We have mentioned Gwen. I think it actually sounds pretty outstanding on Gwen too. That sounds excellent. Like, it would solve stickiness issues on Gwen. I really do like the sounds of that. Good on Alistar. Okay, Declo. Unironically, yes, you are correct. You are right. It is good on Alistar because he's a utility champion who would value the haste there. I'm still going to be building this like all the time on Ivern. Not because the passive is like the passive is better. Mainly just because the stat stick is too overwhelming for that champion, right? Jack's item, it's kind of cool. Yeah, and Zeknal saying that it is pretty much the Black Cleaver for mages, in the sense that it is just a raw stat stick, and when those stats are valuable, that's great. That is correct. Now, Cosmic Drive does have fewer passives than Cleaver, and fewer, overwhelming effects than Cleaver, but it does follow the same line of reasoning. All right, let's look for champions who would value this. Ahri would not value it early, but might value it late. Ahri would value it maybe on 4th. Or something like that. Annie could actually find some value out of it when she's not playing for her raw burst builds, when she's playing for more of a Roa style build, when she's playing more for her utility. Asol doesn't value haste at all, and so he doesn't care about this. Right, who would value the movement speed? We've mentioned Cassiopeia already. There might be some quirky value if he doesn't desperately need the pen. Right. I mean, we're looking at some assassins right here who absolutely would not be purchasing this. Fizz, still theoretically one of the best Fizz items for pseudo tank Fizz. I don't know if this change brings that out yet. I don't think it does just yet. Maybe we get tricky. Every single change we get to this item makes it closer, right? Not Fiddle. Not Fiddle. Fiddlesticks needs his moment of his ultimate to hurt. He doesn't need more ultimates. Mord might want it late. Yeah, I could totally see Mordekaiser in, I can totally see Mordekaiser liking it pre-pivot, before he has to pivot into defensive items. Or as the last item before his pivot. We mentioned Jax. Start to look at melees, start to look at AP bruisers, who are really, really going to be the champions who value this a lot. Karthus can find value out of this, but again, it has to win on comparisons against Deathcap, against Void, against Shadowflame. That's a tall order for this champion in particular. I think it would be an outstanding final item on Karthus if you get late into your build. Well, we say Rylai's is more effective on Mord, but we're not saying that Cosmic Drive needs to be rushed, right? What would that build entail? What would that Mordekaiser build look like? That Mordekaiser build, the heavy AP version, could maybe look something like Rylai's Riftmaker, Cosmic Drive into defenses. Or it could even look like Rylai's Cosmic Drive Jack Show. It could look like that, maybe, right? Would Eve want this? Extremely doubtful. I know she already overkills, but what would the movement speed do for her? What would the haste do for her? It would reduce. It would open more windows for her ultimate, right? But early in the build, no. So basically, what we can conclude looking at champions. Actually, we'll keep looking at champions for a little bit. Lissandra would probably struggle to find this in her build early. Morgana could actually find some value if it's just raw utility. Nico could find some value for raw utility, but she's giving up damage. Nidalee, a lot of these champions could find value for raw utility at the cost of damage, which is a meaningful cost, right? Ryze, a DPS champion, loves this. He would really, really love this. Kayle would love this. The conclusions are clear. Now that we've, kind of looked at everyone and kind of gotten a feel for who would enjoy this new movement speed version of the item. Okay, so utility champions still like it for the stat stick purpose. DPS champions who don't need to compete against penetration, would really enjoy having this stat stick, especially now that the passive is something that they can use. Melee AP bruisers really like this because those are more likely to be DPS champions too, right? And then we have some stragglers like Varus who doesn't value pen and stuff like that, for whom this item is actually quite outstanding. But that's assuming that we're talking about this item on second or third item or something like that. The conclusion we can also draw is at the end of the game, when you have purchased everything that matters, when you're like an Orthodox Burst Mage, like, and you have your Mythic Seraph's Void, or you're not a Seraph's champion, you have Mythic Shadowflame Void, and like your Sorks, and now it's like, okay, do I build Deathcap? Do I build Cosmic or something? Like, you can fit this into the end of your build on pretty much every mage. In terms of implication for your pools and amateur play, I mean, like, if you have some top lane bruisers that you love playing, like Gwen in particular, right? Who have kind of like shifted out of your pool, and you're like, and you need something fun and exciting that you used to love that you want to bring back, like, by all means, if this is your catalyst for doing that, be my guest. I right now cannot foresee any single champion that will become overpowered off this change. Do look at Cassio and Rise again. Yeah, okay, so yeah, but you would make changes to your pool mainly because something you used to play sounds much stronger now that this version of Cosmic is in the game. That is the only reason you would make a change to your pool off this patch. So that's all of the changes in the patch. And it is minor, right? It is very, very minor. All of our criteria says most of this doesn't matter, and the stuff that does matter is either like only potentially useful at top level and not for us, or it remains to be seen, or like, yeah, there's just not a lot that really, really, really matters, right? But that said, cool, awesome Cosmic Drive change.